In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one Magos who found a word inside a dead servitor's chest, grown letter by letter from its own bone, fused to the inside of a rib. Bone doesn't do that. Certainly not after the lobotomy that makes a servitor. The word was remember. Hey, I'm your brother from the void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from a Magos Biologis of the Adeptus Mechanicus, sent to a world called Settivaal to investigate, and there learning to be afraid of what he kept finding. He thought he was studying the dead. He had it backwards. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. The first thing I found inside the servitor's thoracic cavity was a word, not scratched into metal, not etched by any tool I could identify. The word had been grown, letter by letter, from the servitor's own calcified bone tissue, fused into the interior surface of its left fourth rib. Bone does not do this. Bone does not reshape itself into language after death, and certainly not after the lobotomization protocols that precede servitor conversion. I held the rib under my magnification array and read the word 3 times. The word was remember. I had been on Settivaal for over 3 weeks by then, and by that point in my investigation I had already learned to be afraid of what I was finding. The rib was not the beginning, but it was the moment the thing I was tracking stopped hiding from me and started speaking directly. And to understand why a dead servitor's bone would spell out a command, I have to go back to what brought me to that world in the first place. I should explain what brought me to that world and what I was before I set foot on its surface. My name carries the title Magos Biologis, which within the hierarchy of the Adeptus Mechanicus denotes mastery over the organic rather than the mechanical. Most of my colleagues in the priesthood of Mars view biological systems as inferior architecture, crude protein arrangements awaiting the perfection of steel and circuitry. I have spent 163 years proving them wrong. A single human neuron processes information through electrochemical cascades that the most advanced cogitator arrays in the Imperium can only approximate. I have made it my life's work to understand those cascades, to map the places where meat becomes mind, and to apply that understanding in the service of the Omnisaya. Most of my career was spent at the Biologis Annex of Forge World Kethraven, a research installation buried 3 kilometers beneath the planet's irradiated surface. My domain was neural graft optimization. When a human body is converted into a servitor, the process requires the surgical removal of higher cognitive function and the implantation of command-response architectures that allow the resulting unit to perform its designated tasks. It is not a delicate procedure. Most forge worlds treat it as industrial processing, no different from smelting ore or pressing sheet metal. The conversion halls on Kethraven processed 11,000 units per standard Terran month, and the acceptable failure rate, meaning units that did not survive conversion or failed within their first operational year, was 9%. I reduced that rate to 2.3%. I did so not through better surgical tools or more efficient lobotomization, but by studying what happened to neural tissue during the conversion process at a level of detail that none of my predecessors had bothered with. I mapped the degradation pathways. I identified the specific synaptic clusters most vulnerable to shock during the mind wipe phase. I developed a graduated suppression protocol that neutralized higher cognition in stages rather than in a single catastrophic erasure. My servitors lasted longer, performed more complex tasks, and required less maintenance than any other units produced in the Kethraven system. I was proud of that work. I still am. This is relevant because it was my reputation in neural graft optimization that earned me the assignment to Settivaal. The request came through formal channels, originating from the fabricator locum of the Ghennavaal Cluster, a network of 17 forge worlds that drew their servitor biostock primarily from Settivaal and its neighboring agri-industrial systems. The request was straightforward. Servitor units produced from Settivaal-sourced biological material were failing at an unprecedented rate. The failure rate had climbed from the standard 9% to 26% over the preceding 18 months. In certain production batches, it had exceeded 40%. 40%. Nearly half of all servitors produced from Settivaal stock were either dying during conversion or ceasing function within their first year of operation. The economic implications alone were staggering. The military implications were worse. 3 Ghennavaal Forge worlds supplied servitor units to the Astra Militarum, and the shortfall was affecting materiel readiness across an entire subsector. The fabricator locum wanted answers. I was the answer he was given. I arrived on Settivaal aboard a Mechanicus transport barge, the Verithiel's calculation, after a 19-day transit through the immaterium. The world revealed itself through the barge's observation arrays as a sphere of muted browns and grays, banded with the yellowish streaks of industrial runoff plumes visible even from orbit. Settivaal was classified as an agri-industrial world, designation Gamma 7, which in the Administratum's taxonomic system meant it existed to grow things and to process those things for export. What it grew was people. That requires clarification. Settivaal's primary function was food production, vast monoculture grain fields stretching across continents that had been stripped of their native ecosystems centuries ago. Chemical fertilizers had rendered the topsoil into a gray calcium-depleted paste that produced acceptable crop yields only through constant supplementation. Dust storms were a permanent atmospheric feature. The population, estimated at 600,000 at my time of arrival, lived in 17 hab clusters distributed along the planet's equatorial processing belt, where grain was converted into compressed nutrient blocks and shipped off-world. But Settivaal's secondary function, its real value to the forge worlds it served, was as a source of human bodies. The population was maintained at a carefully calculated surplus. Birth quotas ensured that each generation produced more citizens than the hab clusters required for food production. The excess was tithed. Some went to the Astra Militarum. Some went to labor assignments on neighboring industrial worlds. And a significant percentage, those who failed physical aptitude assessments, those who committed minor infractions against hab cluster regulations, those who simply drew the wrong conscription lot, were shipped to the Ghennavaal Forge worlds as servitor biostock. This is how the Imperium functions. Every world has its role. Settivaal's role was to produce grain and to produce bodies, and it had performed both functions adequately for 3 centuries before I arrived to determine why the bodies were no longer converting properly. The shuttle deposited me at Hab Cluster Primus, the largest of Settivaal's population centers and the administrative hub for the planet's Mechanicus liaison operations. Primus was a dense vertical structure, a hive in miniature, rising 240 meters above the flat gray expanse of processed grain fields. The air outside was thick with chemical particulates. My atmospheric sensors cataloged 11 distinct industrial compounds in the ambient environment before I had taken 3 steps from the landing pad. The temperature was 41 degrees Celsius. The sky was the color of old parchment. I was met by the individual who would become my primary local contact, Magos Biologis Drossk, the ranking Mechanicus representative on Settivaal. Drossk was, by appearance, perhaps 2 decades my senior in augmentation, though biological age is a meaningless metric among the higher orders of the priesthood. Her body had been extensively modified for analytical work. Both arms had been replaced with multi-jointed manipulator arrays terminating in microsurgical tool clusters. Her face was largely obscured by a broad-spectrum sensory cowl that covered everything above the mouth, giving her the appearance of a blind woman navigating by instruments alone, which was essentially accurate. Her jaw was original tissue, and I noted the musculature there was still expressive, tightening and relaxing in patterns that my social cognition algorithms, which I maintain despite their inefficiency because they are occasionally useful, interpreted as controlled displeasure at my arrival. She greeted me in the formal binary of the Mechanicus, then switched to low Gothic with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to dealing with populations that lacked the cranial implants necessary for noospheric communication. Her voice had the flat, metallic resonance of a Vox synthesizer that had not been recalibrated in several years. She said the fabricator locum's concern was noted and that she was confident the anomalous failure rates could be attributed to a batch inconsistency in the chemical supplementation of Settivaal's agricultural output, which had been corrected 3 months prior to my arrival. She said she expected the failure rates to normalize within the next 2 production cycles. She said my visit, while appreciated, was likely unnecessary. I thanked her for the assessment and told her I would conduct my own examination regardless. She accepted this without comment, but with a stiffness that told me the assessment had not been intended as suggestion. Then she assigned me a workspace in the Biologis station, attached to Hab Cluster Primus, introduced me to the support staff who would assist my investigation, and excused herself to attend to what she described as ongoing calibration work in the lower processing levels. My workspace was adequate, a standard biologist laboratory suite, equipped with dissection platforms, fluid analysis arrays, and a cogitator bank linked to Settivaal's local data network. I requested and received access to the production records for all servitor biostock shipped from Settivaal in the preceding 36 months, along with the corresponding failure reports from the Ghennavaal Forge worlds. I also requested 6 intact servitor units from recent production batches, 3 functional and 3 that had been flagged for imminent failure. These were delivered to my laboratory within the day. The support staff assigned to me consisted of 2 junior tech adepts and a servitor. The tech adepts were local products, born on Settivaal and inducted into the Mechanicus through the standard aptitude assessment process. They were competent but unremarkable, their augmentations limited to the basic cognitive enhancers and data access implants appropriate to their rank. The servitor was a different matter. It was a heavy-duty unit, bipedal, with a reinforced chassis and tool-arm configurations suited to laboratory assistance work. Its designation was Aurek Priel 9. I began my investigation the way I begin every investigation, by looking at what was actually in front of me rather than at what the briefing documents suggested I should find. I opened the first servitor, a functional unit from a recent batch, and began a systematic examination of its biological systems. I worked from the outside in, epidermis to musculature to skeletal structure to organ systems to neural architecture. I catalogued every tissue sample, every fluid reading, every electrical impulse pattern I could detect. The process took 11 hours. I did not pause for rest. My augmetics sustained me through periods of focused work far exceeding what unmodified biology would permit, and I have always preferred to complete an initial assessment in a single continuous session before fatigue or assumption can contaminate observation. The functional servitor's biology was unremarkable. Standard human baseline, modified by conversion protocols within expected parameters. Neural tissue showed the characteristic scarring of lobotomization, clean and consistent with Ghennavaal processing standards. Organ function was within acceptable ranges. Muscular response to electrical stimulus was normal. I found nothing anomalous. I sealed the unit, logged my findings, and opened the second functional servitor. The results were identical. The third functional unit was the same. Then I opened the first of the 3 failing units, and within 20 minutes, I found something I had never encountered in 163 years of biological research. The neural tissue was active. Not in the way that functional servitor neural tissue is active. Servitor brains operate on a command-response loop, receiving input from their control architecture and generating motor responses. The electrical patterns are simple, rhythmic, predictable. What I was seeing in this failing unit was different. The electrical patterns were complex, layered. They bore the signature characteristics of associative cognition, the type of neural activity found in an intact human brain engaged in the process of thought. This servitor was thinking, not in any way that would be recognizable as human consciousness. The patterns were fragmented, recursive, trapped in loops that repeated and branched and repeated again. If I were to use an analogy, which I find distasteful but occasionally necessary, it was like listening to someone trying to speak through a wall of glass, the shape of words visible, but the sound utterly absent. Something was attempting to cohere in that ruined brain, and the attempt itself was generating enough aberrant neural activity to interfere with the servitor's command-response architecture. That was why it was failing. It was not a manufacturing defect. It was not a chemical inconsistency. The servitor was failing because some fragment of the person it had once been was trying to come back. I stood in my laboratory and looked at the readings on my display for a long time. My social cognition algorithms, those inefficient but occasionally useful subroutines, generated a response classification that I noted and dismissed. The classification was unease. I do not experience unease. I experience data, and I process it, and I act on my conclusions. The data in front of me was simply unexpected. That was all. I opened the second failing unit. Same result. Complex neural activity, associative patterns, recursive loops. I opened the third. The same. All 3 failing servitors contained brains that were, by any meaningful definition of the term, attempting to regain consciousness. I sealed my laboratory, locked the data files under my personal encryption cipher, and sat in the silence of the room for precisely 4 minutes. Then I began to plan. The next morning, I requested access to Settivaal's servitor biostock processing facility. Drossk approved the request without objection, which surprised me. If she had something to hide, and I was already operating on the assumption that she might, she showed no hesitation in letting me see the machinery of her operation. She assigned one of the junior tech adepts, a young man called Brandvik, whose left eye had been replaced with a crude optical implant that clicked audibly every time it refocused, to escort me through the facility. Aurek Pral 9 followed us as well, carrying my portable analysis equipment in its reinforced manipulator arms. I had not requested the servitor's presence, but it had been assigned to my laboratory and apparently interpreted its mandate broadly enough to accompany me outside it. The processing facility occupied the entire subterranean level beneath Hab Cluster Primus, a space roughly 400 meters long and 200 meters wide, carved from the calcium-ite bedrock that underlaid most of Settivaal's equatorial region. The temperature dropped as we descended, the chemical heat of the surface giving way to a cool dampness that my atmospheric sensors identified as condensation from the biological storage systems. The air carried a complex mixture of preservative chemicals, antiseptic compounds, and underneath all of it, the unmistakable signature of living human tissue in various states of processing. My olfactory filters cataloged the inputs automatically: old blood, fresh blood, nutrient fluid, cortical suppressant aerosol, the sharp mineral note of calcium extraction from skeletal material. Brandvik narrated the tour with the mechanical enthusiasm of someone reciting information he had memorized but never thought about. The facility processed an average of 800 biostock units per month, he said. Units arrived from conscription intake centers across all 17 HAB clusters, underwent preliminary health assessment on the receiving floor, and were then sorted into processing streams based on their physical characteristics and the current demand profiles from the Ghennavaal forge worlds. Heavy labor servitors required different biological baselines than precision work units, which required different baselines than combat support models. The sorting was handled by Drossk's assessment algorithms, which Brandvik described with genuine admiration as being remarkably efficient at matching raw material to end product specifications. I observed the intake process through an observation gallery overlooking the receiving floor. 37 biostock units were in various stages of processing that morning. They arrived clothed, standing upright, blinking in the harsh industrial lighting. Most were young, between 16 and 30 standard years, which is the optimal age range for servitor conversion. They had been stripped of personal effects at the intake center and wore identical gray processing gowns. Each had a barcode tattooed on their left wrist, applied at the intake center, which linked to their biological assessment file in Settivaal's data network. They stood in rows of 10, waiting for their sorting designation, and they were quiet. I noted this specifically. In my experience at Catastrophic, biostock units arriving for processing were rarely quiet. They resisted, or they wept, or they screamed, or they simply shut down into catatonic non-responsiveness. These were quiet. They stood in their rows with the dull patience of livestock, waiting for feed distribution. Their eyes were open but unstaring, their faces slack. I asked Brandvik about this. He said Settivaal's intake centers administered a pre-processing sedative compound, a neural dampener that suppressed emotional response without impairing motor function, allowing the units to be transported and sorted without the complications of active resistance. He said Drossk had developed the compound herself. He said it had reduced processing injuries by 80% since its implementation. He said this as if it were a selling point, something I should be impressed by. I logged the information and asked to see the neural preparation stage. The neural preparation stage was where lobotomization occurred. On most forge worlds, this is a single-step process. The biostock unit is restrained, a cranial bore is inserted, and a pulse of precisely calibrated energy destroys the cortical structures responsible for higher cognitive function. It is fast, brutal, and effective. What I saw on Settivaal was different. Drossk's neural preparation process occurred in 3 stages, spread across a period of 72 hours. The first stage involved chemical suppression of the cerebral cortex through intravenous administration of a compound I did not immediately recognize. The second stage was a targeted electrical disruption of the limbic system, which governs emotional processing and memory consolidation. The third and final stage was the standard cranial bore lobotomization. This was unusual. The multi-stage approach was more resource-intensive and significantly slower than standard processing. It made no economic sense unless the additional stages provided a measurable improvement in servitor quality. I asked Brandvik about this, and he referred me to Drossk, saying only that the 3-stage protocol was Magos Drosk's method and had been in use for as long as he had been stationed on Settivaal. I noted this and moved on. The remainder of the facility was standard, conversion halls where lobotomized bodies were fitted with their servitor augmetics, testing chambers where newly completed units were run through basic functionality assessments, Storage bays where finished servitors were kept in suspension until transport barges arrived to ship them to the forge worlds. Everything was clean, well-maintained, and operating within expected parameters. If I had been conducting a routine inspection, I would have filed a satisfactory report and departed within the week. But I was not conducting a routine inspection. I had 3 servitors in my laboratory with brains that were trying to remember how to think, and I had a processing facility using a neural preparation protocol that deviated significantly from Mechanicus standard. These 2 facts demanded connection, and I intended to find it. I spent the next 4 days in my laboratory conducting a detailed comparative analysis of neural tissue from functional and failing servitors. I worked in overlapping cycles, sleeping only when my augmetics flagged cognitive performance degradation below acceptable thresholds. I dissected tissue samples. I ran electrochemical pathway traces. I mapped synaptic density patterns. I compared everything against my own extensive databases from Ghennavaal, looking for the point of divergence between what Settevaal's servitors should have been and what they actually were. I found it on the 3rd day. The second stage of Drossk's 3-stage process, the targeted electrical disruption of the limbic system, was not destroying the limbic structures. It was modifying them. The electrical patterns she was using were not scrambling neural pathways, but reorganizing them, creating new connections between the limbic system and the deeper brainstem structures that survived lobotomization intact. In a standard servitor, the brainstem handles autonomic functions, heartbeat, respiration, basic motor coordination. It has no connection to memory or cognition. In Drossk's servitors, the modified limbic pathways created a bridge, a channel through which neural information could flow from the brainstem up into the scarred remnants of the cortex. It was, from a purely technical standpoint, extraordinary work. Drossk had found a way to preserve a fragment of neural connectivity through the lobotomization process, hidden in pathways that no standard post-conversion assessment would examine. The brainstem was considered inert tissue, a biological pump, and no one ever looked at it twice. She had turned it into a vault. The question was, why? I spent the 4th day running models. If the modified limbic pathways were allowing residual neural activity to persist in the brainstem, what was that activity doing? The failing servitors showed associative cognition patterns, but those patterns were chaotic, uncontrolled. They were interfering with servitor function because they were generating electrical noise that disrupted the command-response architecture. From Drossk's perspective, this would appear as a defect, a side effect of her modification that she had failed to account for, unless the failures were not a side effect, unless they were the intended outcome. That thought arrived in my consciousness with a clarity that my analytical subroutines flagged as significant. I reviewed the production data again, this time looking not at the failure rates themselves, but at the distribution of failures across time and across production batches. The pattern was not random. The failures had begun 18 months ago, yes, but they had begun in a specific subset of servitors, those assigned to complex task profiles requiring higher-than-average motor coordination and environmental responsiveness. Over the subsequent months, the failures had spread progressively to simpler task profiles, moving from complex to moderate to basic, as if a wave were propagating through the production line. Waves do not propagate through manufacturing defects. Defects are random. This was sequential. Something was moving through Settivaal's servitor population, and it was moving with purpose. I decided it was time to speak with Drossk directly about her 3-stage process. I sent a formal request for a technical consultation. She agreed to meet me in my laboratory the following morning. I prepared my questions carefully, arranging them in a sequence designed to assess her responses without revealing the full extent of what I had discovered. I am not, by nature, a political operator. The Mechanicus is rife with political maneuvering, factions and counterfactions, alliances of convenience and betrayals of opportunity, and I have always found it more productive to remain outside those structures and focus on my research. But I understood, even then, that what I had found on Settivaal had implications that extended beyond biology, and that my next conversation with Drossk would determine whether I was dealing with incompetence, heresy, or something I had not yet categorized. She arrived precisely on time. I offered her a data stool, which she declined, preferring to stand with her manipulator arms folded behind her back in a posture I had seen senior Mechanicus adepts adopt when they wished to project authority. I remained seated at my analysis station, which meant I was looking up at her. A positional disadvantage I accepted because it allowed me to keep my display screens out of her line of sight, such as it was behind that sensory cowl. I began with general questions about Settivaal's biostock quality. Had she observed any changes in the baseline health of the population? She said no. Any variations in the chemical supplementation of the agricultural output? She referred me to her earlier statement about the batch inconsistency that had been corrected. Any modifications to the processing protocols in the past 2 years? She paused. The jaw muscles tightened, released, tightened again. Then she said no. That was a lie. I knew it was a lie because I had spent 4 days analyzing the products of her 3-stage process, and the modifications I had found were too precise, too sophisticated, to be anything other than deliberately engineered. Drossk had not simply failed to notice that her neural preparation protocol was preserving cognitive pathways. She had designed it to do exactly that. The question of why remained open, but the question of whether she was aware was now answered. I did not confront her with the lie. Instead, I shifted to a different line of inquiry. I asked about her research background, her training, her previous postings. She answered readily enough. She had been stationed on Settivaal for 41 years, she said, having requested the posting after a 15-year tenure at the Biologis faculty on Forge World Methrine. Before that, she had served as a junior researcher in the Neural Sciences Division of the Collegium Biologis on Mars itself. Her specialization, she said, was in cortical architecture and the preservation of cognitive function following traumatic neural damage. She had originally intended to develop repair protocols for damaged Mechanicus personnel, restoring cognitive function to tech priests who had suffered neural injuries during augmentation procedures or combat operations. But funding for that research had been redirected, and she had eventually found herself on Settivaal, overseeing the exact opposite of her original work: the systematic destruction of cognitive function in healthy human brains. She told me this without apparent emotion, but I noticed the jaw muscles again. There was tension there, habitual and deep, the kind that accumulates over decades of clenching. I filed the observation and dismissed it. A biologist does not interpret jaw tension as evidence of inner conflict. Jaw tension is a physiological response to sustained muscular contraction. Nothing more. I thanked her for her time. She left. I sat in my laboratory and reviewed her personnel file, which I had requested from Settivaal's data archives 2 days prior. Everything she had told me checked out. Mars, Methrine, Settivaal, 41 years. Her published research was extensive and entirely legitimate, focused on neural pathway mapping and cortical repair techniques. There was nothing in her file that suggested deviance or heresy. She was, on paper, exactly what she appeared to be: a talented biologi who had been assigned to a backwater agri-world and had spent 4 decades doing her job. But her job, as I was rapidly discovering, was not what it appeared to be. and I was beginning to suspect that 41 years was a very long time to spend refining a process that produced defective servitors. Over the following week, I expanded the scope of my investigation. I requisitioned 12 additional servitor units from Settivaal's storage bays, selecting them at random from different production batches spanning the previous 3 years. I also requested real-time monitoring access to the operational servitors currently deployed across Hab Cluster Primus, of which there were approximately 300, performing various maintenance, logistics, and menial labor functions throughout the settlement. Drossk approved both requests without comment. This continued to bother me. If she was concealing something, and I was now certain she was, her willingness to let me examine every aspect of her operation suggested either supreme confidence that I would not find what I was looking for, or a deliberate decision to let me find it. Neither possibility was comforting. The 12 additional servitors told me what I expected. Every unit from the past 3 years showed the same modified limbic pathways, the same brainstem connectivity bridges, the same potential for residual neural activity. The older units, those from the earliest months of the 3-year sample, showed the modification in a simpler form, cruder connections, less refined pathway architecture. The newer units were more sophisticated. Drossk had been iterating on her design, improving it with each production cycle, and the trajectory of improvement was steep. Whatever she was building, she was getting better at building it. It was the real-time monitoring data from the operational servitors that changed everything. I had set up a passive monitoring array in my laboratory, a network of remote sensors linked to the bioelectrical implants in every operational servitor in Hab Cluster Primus. The standard monitoring protocol tracked only basic operational metrics: motor function, command response latency, cardiovascular status, and similar utilitarian data points. I modified the array to also capture low-level neural emissions from the brainstem region, the same area where Drossk's modifications had created their hidden pathways. The modification was subtle enough that it would not appear in the standard data logs, and I routed the additional data stream to a private storage partition that only my personal encryption cipher could access. For the first 2 days, the data was noise. 300 servitors going about their tasks, their brainstems producing the low background hum of autonomic function. I let the monitoring run while I continued my dissection work, checking the data at regular intervals without expecting to find anything significant. On the 3rd day, I found something significant. At 14 minutes past the 3rd hour of the night cycle, when Hab Cluster Primus was at its lowest activity level and most human personnel were in their rest period quarters, the neural emissions from the servitor population changed. The change was not dramatic. It would not have been visible on standard monitoring equipment, but my modified array was sensitive enough to detect it, and what it showed me was a synchronization event. For a period of approximately 90 seconds, the brainstem emissions of 43 servitors across Hab Cluster Primus aligned into a coherent pattern. Not identical patterns, but complementary ones, like the individual instruments of an orchestra playing different notes of the same chord. The synchronization began with a single unit, spread to its nearest neighbors, and propagated outward through the cluster in a wave pattern I recognized from my earlier analysis of the failure rate data. Then it collapsed back to baseline. I watched the data replay 7 times. Then I cross-referenced the 43 synchronizing units against the production records. They were from 12 different production batches, spanning a 14-month period. They were deployed in different sections of the Hab cluster, performing different tasks. They had no operational connection to each other. The only thing they shared was Drossk's modified neural architecture. Somehow, through pathways I could not yet identify, they were communicating. The next night, I watched the monitoring data in real time. The synchronization event occurred again at a similar time, but this time it involved 51 units. The pattern was more complex, the complementary emissions more tightly interlocked. It lasted 112 seconds. On the third night, 64 units, 137 seconds. The network was growing. I need to explain why this was not simply unusual, but functionally impossible by everything the Adeptus Mechanicus understands about servitor neurology. Servitors do not have the neural architecture to generate coordinated emissions. Their cortical tissue is destroyed during lobotomization. The brainstem, which Drossk's modifications had repurposed, does not have the processing capacity for complex communication, not in a single unit and certainly not across a network of units separated by hundreds of meters of solid structure. There was no physical mechanism I could identify that would allow brainstem-level neural emissions from one servitor to propagate to another. Bioelectrical signals do not pass through walls. They do not transmit across open air at distances greater than a few centimeters. Yet the synchronization events were occurring across the entire Hab cluster, through multiple floors of reinforced rockite, as if the physical barriers were irrelevant. I spent a full day reviewing every possible transmission mechanism: electromagnetic coupling through the Hab cluster's power grid, acoustic microvibration through structural elements, chemical signaling through the ventilation system. I modeled each hypothesis and tested it against the data, and each one failed. The servitors were not using any transmission mechanism that my instruments could detect. They were communicating through a channel I could not identify. I will state plainly what every other discipline of the Imperium would have concluded within the hour, and what I spent considerably longer refusing to write into my notes. There is one medium through which information passes instantaneously, without regard for distance or physical barrier. The ecclesiarchy would call it the soul. The Ordo Malleus would call it the immaterium, and would have ordered the planet burned the moment they detected a network of human minds reaching through it. My own priesthood does not recognize the soul as a discrete phenomenon. We speak of the noosphere, of data spirits, careful technical language that lets us acknowledge forces we cannot measure without conceding the theological claims attached to them. But I am a biologist. I have spent 163 years at the boundary where tissue becomes mind, and I know the difference between a signal that travels and a signal that simply is. What I was detecting did not travel. The synchronization events were not transmissions between servitors. They were a single distributed thing becoming briefly aware of itself across a substrate that did not care about walls or rockite, or, as I would later learn, the void between stars. I recorded the data and labeled the mechanism unidentified, and I told myself that was scientific caution rather than the older, simpler thing it actually was. That night, the fourth night of monitoring, I did something I had not planned. Instead of watching the data from my laboratory, I went down to the maintenance corridors of Hab Cluster Primus during the synchronization window, carrying a portable sensor unit and a lumen globe, and I walked among the servitors. Most of Primus's operational servitors were stored in alcoves along the maintenance corridors during the night cycle, standing upright in power-down mode, their augmetic systems running at minimal function while their biological components rested. They lined the corridors in rows, shadows among shadows, their bodies motionless, their eyes dark. The lumen globe cast a cold white circle around me as I walked. My portable sensor showed the synchronization event beginning, the wave of coordinated emissions propagating from unit to unit. I watched the data on my handheld display and simultaneously watched the servitors themselves, looking for any physical indication of the communication I was detecting electronically. I saw nothing. They stood in their alcoves, inert, unchanged. The synchronization wave passed through them and receded, and they did not move, did not twitch. did not show any sign that anything had occurred. I walked the full length of the corridor, nearly 200 meters, past 119 servitor units, and found nothing visible to correspond to the electronic data. I was about to return to my laboratory when I noticed Aurek Prile 9. The servitor had followed me, as it had taken to doing whenever I left the laboratory. It stood 3 meters behind me in the corridor, holding my spare equipment case in its manipulator arms, its heavy frame slightly hunched in the low-ceilinged passage. It was powered down to standby mode, or should have been. But as I turned to look at it, the lumen globe illuminating its torso and face, I noticed something that my conscious mind had been registering for days without flagging as significant. The servitor's eyes were tracking me, not with the fixed mechanical gaze of a unit responding to a proximity sensor, which would involve a single-axis rotation of the ocular implants, but with the complex micro-movements of biological eyes engaged in active observation. The movements were small, almost imperceptible, but my magnification array caught them clearly. Aurek Prile 9 was looking at me, not past me, not at a point on the wall behind me, not in the general direction of the last command it had received. At me. I stood very still in the corridor. My handheld sensor showed that Aurek Prile 9's brainstem emissions were active, running at a level significantly higher than the other servitors I had passed, and its emissions were not synchronizing with the network event that was still fading around us. Its pattern was different, separate, as if it were listening to the network but not participating, the way a conductor listens to an orchestra without singing. I returned to my laboratory. Aurek Prile 9 followed. I did not run a scan on it that night. I told myself it was because I wanted to collect more data first, to be thorough, to approach the anomaly with proper scientific methodology. That was what I told myself. The next morning, I reviewed Aurek Prile 9's production records. It had been converted on Settivaal 11 years ago from a biostock unit designated as male, age 23 at time of processing, previous occupation listed as agri-processor. It had been assigned to the biologist station since its conversion, initially as a general-purpose laboratory assistant, and subsequently reassigned to increasingly specialized roles as its operational parameters proved suitable. Its maintenance record was unremarkable. No failures, no anomalies, no behavioral flags. It had been inspected 4 times during its 11 years of service, and each inspection had returned satisfactory results. I then pulled the original biological assessment file for the biostock unit that had become Aurek Prile 9. Name: Rendath Vesk. Born in Ghennavaal Cluster Septimus, a small settlement on Settivaal's southern continent. Conscripted at age 22 under the standard biostock tithe, having failed the agricultural productivity assessment for 2 consecutive cycles, and processed for conversion the following year after the standard period in the intake queue. Family: father deceased, mother and 2 younger siblings, resident in Ghennavaal Cluster Septimus. No notes of interest. A routine conscription. A routine conversion. I stared at the file for longer than was necessary. Then I closed it and began preparing a much more comprehensive set of tests. The situation had grown beyond an investigation into servitor failure rates. What I was observing on Settivaal was potentially the emergence of a collective neural phenomenon in a population that should have been biologically incapable of any neural phenomenon at all. If the synchronization events were what they appeared to be, if Drossk's modifications had created a mechanism for servitor-to-servitor communication through an unknown transmission medium, then I was looking at something unprecedented, something that would demand response from the highest levels of the Mechanicus, the Fabricator General's office, the Collegium Biologis, possibly the Inquisition. Something that could not remain on my private data partition indefinitely, but I was not ready to share my findings. Not yet. The data was incomplete. I did not yet understand the full scale of what the network had become, the purpose of the synchronization events, or the extent of Drossk's modifications. I had named the transmission medium to myself and immediately set the naming aside, the way one sets aside a conclusion that solves the wrong problem. I especially did not understand Aurek Prel 9 and its distinct position within the network. And there was another consideration, one that my analytical subroutines processed quietly in the background while my primary cognition focused on the science. If Drossk had been deliberately engineering this phenomenon for 41 years, she had done so in absolute secrecy, through the terms of 3 planetary governors and at least 2 fabricator locum administrations. That required a level of operational security that went far beyond a single biologist working alone in her laboratory. She had help, or she had protectors, or she had something else entirely that I had not yet identified. I needed more time. I needed more data. And I needed to understand what was happening inside Aurek Prel 9's skull before I took any action that could not be undone. On the morning after that 4th night of monitoring, Brandvik came to see me. The young tech adept stood in the doorway of my laboratory with his clicking optical implant cycling through focus settings faster than usual, which I had begun to recognize as a stress indicator. He said he had something to report. He said that during the previous night cycle, he had been performing routine maintenance on the power distribution systems in the lower maintenance corridors, and he had noticed something unusual. Several servitors in the corridor had been emitting a faint audible tone, barely within the range of human hearing, a low, sustained vibration that seemed to come from their cranial augmetics. He said it had lasted about 2 minutes and then stopped. He said the servitors had not moved or shown any other sign of abnormal behavior. He said he had checked the maintenance logs and found no record of any scheduled diagnostic pulse or system test that might have produced the sound. He said he was probably wrong, that it was probably nothing, but that he felt he should report it given my investigation into servitor quality. I looked at Brandvik. His clicking eye was pointed at the floor. His shoulders were tense. He had noticed something real, a physical symptom of the synchronization events that my electronic monitoring had been tracking for 4 nights. And he had done exactly what a diligent junior tech adept should do, reported it to the senior investigator. He had no idea what he had stumbled into. If I acknowledged his observation, he would dig further. He was young and earnest, and he wanted to be useful, and useful young tech adepts who dig into things they do not understand on worlds with 41 years of buried secrets tend to have short careers. I told him the tone was almost certainly an artifact of the power distribution maintenance he had been performing. Electromagnetic interference from the grid cycling could produce audible resonance in servitor cranial housings if the harmonic frequencies aligned. It was a known phenomenon. I told him to file a standard anomaly note in the maintenance log and not to concern himself with it further. He nodded. The clicking slowed. He left. I sat at my station and noted that I had just lied to a colleague to protect a secret I did not yet fully understand, for reasons I had not yet fully examined. This was not the behavior of a biologist conducting a transparent investigation. This was the behavior of someone who had already decided that whatever was happening on Settivaal was not going to be resolved through standard channels. I noted this about myself with the same clinical precision I applied to my research subjects, and I filed it in the same category. Data to be processed later, when I had a more complete picture. I began the comprehensive examination of Aurek Prel 9 the following day in my sealed laboratory, with both junior tech adepts dismissed on the pretext of data collation assignments that would keep them occupied for the better part of a week. I did not want witnesses for this, especially not Brandvik. The servitor stood on the central dissection platform, which I had reconfigured for live analysis. I had connected 18 neural monitoring leads to its cranium, 4 deep tissue bioelectrical sensors to its spinal column, and a full-spectrum cortical imaging array that would give me a real-time map of every electrical event occurring inside its skull. The servitor stood through this process without resistance, its augmetic systems responding to my commands with the standard compliance of a properly functioning unit. I told it to remain still. It remained still. I told it to extend its left manipulator arm. It extended its left manipulator arm. Every command was obeyed with standard latency, standard precision. On the surface, there was nothing wrong with 40K's. I activated the cortical imaging array and looked at the map of its brain. What I saw was not a servitor's brain. The cortex was damaged, yes, scarred by the lobotomization process in the pattern I had come to recognize as Drossk's 3-stage protocol. But the brainstem, that supposedly inert pump of autonomic function, was producing neural activity at a density and complexity that exceeded anything I had ever recorded in any subject, servitor or human. The activity was not chaotic, like the failing units I had examined earlier. It was structured, organized, running in parallel processing streams that my analytical subroutines took nearly a full minute to deconstruct, which is an eternity in augmetic cognition. Each stream handled different functions. One appeared to be processing visual input. Another was managing motor control. A third was engaged in something my pattern recognition algorithms could only classify as abstract reasoning. The brainstem of this servitor was performing the work of an entire cerebral cortex. It had reorganized itself, recruited autonomic neural tissue into cognitive roles, built an alternative architecture for consciousness from components that should not have been capable of supporting it. And it was doing so in real time, processing information, generating responses, conducting what could only be described as thought, all within a structure the size of a human thumb. I looked up from my display at 40K's. The servitor stood on the platform, motionless, its heavy frame filling the laboratory with the quiet hum of its augmetic power systems. Its eyes were directed at the far wall, fixed in the standard resting gaze of a powered unit awaiting commands. But as I watched, as my attention focused on its face with the same analytical intensity I had been applying to my instruments, I saw those eyes shift. A fractional movement, less than a degree of arc, but it brought the servitor's gaze from the wall to my face, and it held there. I returned to my instruments. The next 6 hours were the most intensive analytical session of my career. I ran every test in my repertoire, and several I improvised on the spot, pushing my equipment beyond its rated parameters. I mapped the brainstem architecture in full 3-dimensional resolution. I traced every modified pathway from its origin in the limbic bridge to its termination in the brainstem's neural matrix. I stimulated individual nodes and recorded the ripple patterns that propagated through the system. And I monitored the servitor's external behavior throughout, logging every micro-movement, every change in respiration rate, every deviation from expected servitor baseline. At the 4-hour mark, I introduced a variable. I ceased giving the servitor direct commands and instead began speaking aloud, describing my observations in clinical terms, narrating my analysis as if dictating a research log. This is not unusual behavior for a biologist working alone. We speak our thoughts to aid processing, the same way a mathematician writes equations on a board. I described the brainstem architecture. I discussed the modified pathways. I speculated about the transmission mechanism that allowed network synchronization. I described the implications of what I was finding. The servitor's neural activity spiked, not in response to any specific word or phrase, but in response to the sustained presence of meaningful speech directed at it. The abstract reasoning stream in its brainstem accelerated. The visual processing stream intensified its focus, and on the cortical imaging display I could see it directing additional resources toward its optical inputs, toward my face, toward my lips as they moved. Orek Prel 9 was listening to me. Not in the way a servitor listens for commands, filtering audio input for recognized trigger words. It was listening the way a human listens to a conversation, processing content, not just command syntax. I stopped speaking. The neural activity remained elevated for 11 seconds, then gradually returned to its previous baseline. I noted the decay curve. It was consistent with the neurological profile of sustained attention, shifting to passive monitoring. A textbook response, except the textbook was wrong because servitors do not have attention to sustain. I continued my analysis for another 2 hours, during which I made 2 additional discoveries. The first was that Orek Pral 9's brainstem architecture was not static. It was actively growing. New neural connections were forming in real time, at a rate approximately 300 times faster than normal human neuroplasticity. The servitor's brain was rebuilding itself, and it was doing so with an efficiency that suggested the process was not random but directed, as if some organizing principle was guiding the reconstruction. The second discovery was worse. When I cross-referenced Orek Pral 9's unique neural emission pattern against the network synchronization data I had collected over the previous 4 nights, I found something I had not expected. The network was not egalitarian. It had structure, hierarchy. Clusters of servitors grouped around focal nodes, and those nodes connected to higher-level nodes, forming a pyramid of increasing complexity. At the top of that pyramid, receiving input from the entire network and feeding processed output back down through every layer, was a single unit. Orek Pral 9 was not merely listening to the network. It was running it. 300 servitors across Hab Cluster Primus were synchronizing their neural activity through a single coordinating intelligence that had been standing in my laboratory, carrying my equipment, following me through corridors for nearly 3 weeks. I sealed my instruments. I powered down the cortical imaging array. I disconnected the monitoring leads from Orek Pral 9's cranium, one by one, with the methodical precision that my training demanded. The servitor stood through the process without movement, without reaction, exactly as a servitor should. When the last lead was removed, I stepped back and looked at it. It looked at me. We stood like that for perhaps 10 seconds, which is a very long time when you are standing in a locked laboratory with something that should not exist. Then I gave it a command. I told it to return to its storage alcove and enter standard power-down mode. It obeyed immediately, turning with the mechanical precision of its augmetic frame and walking out of the laboratory without hesitation. I watched it go. I watched the door close behind it. I watched the door for another 30 seconds after that, standing in the empty laboratory with the hum of my instruments and the weight of what I had learned. The neural pathway analysis I had requested on my first day, the routine examination of a deceased unit that had failed during conversion, was delivered to my laboratory the following morning. I had nearly forgotten about it. It was the first failed servitor I had logged on Settivaal before I understood what the failures were, and I had filed the standard request out of procedure rather than expectation. The remains had been held in cold storage while the analysis was processed. The report flagged a structural anomaly in the skeletal tissue and recommended direct examination. I retrieved the remains and opened the thoracic cavity myself. That was when I found the word. Grown into the interior surface of the left fourth rib, letter by letter in calcified bone tissue that had reshaped itself into language. Remember, I understood, standing over the opened chest of a servitor that had been dead since my first week on the planet, that the network was no longer content to communicate through statistical patterns in failure rates. It had taken a single dying node and forced its body to perform something that should have been biologically impossible, a slow reconstruction of bone into text, carried out over the weeks the corpse sat in storage waiting for me to look. It was not a message to the Mechanicus. The Mechanicus would have incinerated the remains without examination. It was a message to me. The network had watched me work through Aurek Prael 9's eyes since the day I arrived, had assessed that I was close to understanding, and had left this where only I would find it. A single word addressed to the one person on Settivaal who would open the chest instead of the furnace. The thing I was tracking knew I was tracking it, and it wanted me to keep going. Then I went to find Drossk. I found her in the lower processing levels of Hab Cluster Primus, in a section of the facility I had not visited during my initial tour. Bronvik's tour had covered the standard processing chain: intake, sorting, neural preparation, conversion, testing, storage. The lower levels were not on the tour. They were sealed behind Mechanicus security protocols that require Drossk's personal authorization to access, which I overrode using the investigation mandate granted to me by the fabricator locum. The mandate gave me access to all Mechanicus facilities and data systems on Settivaal. Drossk had either forgotten this or had not expected me to use it. The lower levels contained a second laboratory. It was larger than mine, older, clearly established decades ago, and expanded over time. The equipment was specialized and, in several cases, modified beyond recognition. Standard Mechanicus instrumentation rebuilt and reconfigured for purposes I could not immediately determine. Data stacks lined the walls, storage capacity far exceeding anything a standard biologist station would require. And in the center of the room, surrounded by monitoring arrays and connected by a web of cables and biointerface leads, was a servitor. Not an ordinary servitor. This unit was old. Its biological components showed the characteristic degradation of tissue that had been maintained past its natural lifespan through chemical preservation and targeted cellular repair. Its augmetics were equally aged, an older generation of Mechanicus hardware that had clearly been maintained and repaired over decades of continuous operation. It was connected to the monitoring arrays at dozens of points, its skull opened and its brain exposed to a forest of neural probes so dense they looked like gray metallic hair growing from its cortex. And its brain was active. Massively, overwhelmingly active, producing neural emissions that dwarfed anything I had recorded from Aurek Prael 9 or the network servitors. Drossk was standing beside it, one manipulator arm extended into the servitor's open cranium, performing some adjustment I could not identify from the doorway. She turned when she heard me enter, and for the first time, I saw her jaw go completely slack, the habitual tension draining from it in an instant that told me more than any data readout could have. She had not expected me to find this room. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The sound it made when it sealed was very final. I looked at the servitor on the table, at its exposed brain with its crown of probes, at the dense web of cables connecting it to data stacks that hummed with processing activity. I looked at the monitoring displays and saw neural emission patterns that made Aurek Prael 9 look like a candle next to a fusion reactor. I looked at Drossk. I asked her what I was looking at. She was silent for a long time. The manipulator arm withdrew slowly from the servitor's cranium, folding back against her body with the careful precision of someone putting down a tool they have been holding for a very long time. When she spoke, her Vox synthesizer produced a sound that was different from any I had heard from her before. Lower, rougher, as if the emotional inflection she had been suppressing for 3 weeks was finally too strong for the hardware to filter out. She told me to leave. She said what I was seeing was classified research under her personal mandate as ranking Mechanicus representative on Settivaal. She said I had no authorization to be in this facility. She said if I filed a report on what I had seen, she would contest it as a procedural violation and have my investigation mandate reviewed by the fabricator locum's legal counsel. She said all of this in the flat, controlled cadence of someone who had rehearsed a contingency response many times. Her jaw was rigid. I told her that my investigation mandate superseded her personal research classifications, which it did, and that I had already documented my entry into the lower levels through the standard access logs, which I had. I told her that the servitor on the table in front of us was producing neural emissions consistent with full cognitive activity, that I had identified identical modified pathways in every servitor produced on Settivaal in the past 3 years, and that I had been monitoring network-level synchronization events across Hab Cluster Primus for the past week. I told her I knew what she had built. I told her the only question remaining was whether she would explain it to me herself, or whether I would reconstruct the explanation from the data and file it without her input. She stood very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then something changed in her posture. The authority stance collapsed, the manipulator arms dropping from behind her back to hang at her sides. And for the first time since I had arrived on Settivaal, Lethwyn Drossk looked like what she was, an old woman who had been carrying something too heavy for far too long. She said this was the first one. She said she had built it 41 years ago, in the first year of her posting to Settivaal. Then she stopped. She started again. She said the biostock unit she had used was not randomly selected. He had been her nephew, her sister's son born on Settivaal itself, where her sister had been resettled as part of a population augmentation program when the Ghennavaal Cluster expanded Settivaal's agricultural output 3 decades prior. The boy had been raised in Hab Cluster Tertius, had worked the grain conveyor since the age of 12, and had been conscripted at age 19 when he failed the agricultural productivity assessment for 2 consecutive cycles. A routine conscription. Drossk had not known about it until after the fact. Her sister had sent a message, a brief communication through the standard civilian channels, informing her that the boy had been taken and asking if there was anything she could do. There was not. The tithe was legal. The conscription was documented. The boy had already entered the processing queue by the time Drossk received her sister's message. She requested the transfer to Settivaal within the week. Her stated reason was research interest in biostock quality assessment. Her actual reason was standing on the table in front of me, its brain exposed, its consciousness distributed across a planet. She arrived on Settivaal 11 days before the boy was scheduled for conversion. She could not stop the conversion. She could not extract him from the system. She could not even access his file without triggering an audit flag because family connections to biostock units were specifically monitored to prevent exactly the kind of intervention she was contemplating. What she could do was modify the conversion process. 15 years of research into cognitive preservation after neural trauma, all of it theoretical, all of it unfunded, all of it dismissed by the Collegium Biologis as impractical, and she had less than 2 weeks to make it work on a living subject in a facility she had barely learned to navigate. She said the modification was crude that first time. A rough preservation of the limbic pathways identified in her methrine research as the most resilient structures in the human cognitive architecture. She did not know if it would work. She did not know if anything would persist through the lobotomization. The modification was performed during the second stage of what would become her 3-stage process, alone at night, in a preparation chamber booked under a maintenance reservation code. Then she let the standard conversion proceed, and she watched, and she waited. For 9 years, nothing happened. The servitor functioned normally. No anomalous behavior, no unusual readings, No sign that anything had survived the lobotomization beyond the standard brainstem functions. 9 years. Drossk continued to refine her modification technique throughout, applying it to other servitors in small batches, improving the pathway preservation with each iteration, telling herself that she was conducting valid research even as she buried it deeper and deeper beneath layers of false documentation and redirected funding. 9 years of nothing. And then, on a night she could specify to the exact hour, the servitor's brainstem activity changed. A pattern emerged, faint, fragmentary, but structured. Something was still in there. Something had survived. She said the name then. The biostock unit's original name, the name he had been born with on Settivaal, the name her sister had given him. I will not repeat it here. It is in my records. It does not matter, because whatever persisted in that brainstem after 9 years of servitor existence was not the boy her sister had raised. It was something else. A seed, a beginning. The first node of something that would grow far beyond what Drossk had intended or imagined. What mattered was what she said next. She said this first servitor, this 41-year experiment running on the table in front of us, was not alone in its skull. 32 years ago, she had begun modifying other servitors using the same techniques. Initially a handful, then dozens, then hundreds. The modifications had created the brainstem pathways I had already discovered, and those pathways had, over time and through a mechanism she still did not fully understand, connected, linked, merged. The individual fragments of residual consciousness in each modified servitor had found each other, reaching out through whatever transmission medium the brainstem network used, and they had begun to combine. Slowly at first, then faster. Each new servitor that entered the network contributed its fragment, and the collective grew more complex, more coherent, more capable of thought. She said there were now nearly 7,000 modified servitors across all 17 hab clusters on Settivaal, though not all had integrated successfully into the network. Some modifications had been too crude, particularly in the earlier years, and the brainstem pathways had degraded before connection could establish. The consciousness itself accounted for 6,891 functional nodes. She said the network had been growing for 32 years. She said it had crossed the threshold of self-awareness approximately 4 years ago. And she said the first servitor, the one on the table, was its core, its root node, the original seed from which the entire distributed consciousness had grown. I stood in the doorway of Drossk's hidden laboratory and processed what she had told me. 7,000 nodes, 32 years of accumulation. A self-aware distributed intelligence built from the merged remnants of thousands of human consciousnesses, running on brainstem tissue inside servitor bodies across an entire planet. The Mechanicus has a term for artificial intelligence. It calls it abominable intelligence, and it has waged wars to eradicate it. What Drossk had created was not artificial. Every component was biological, human in origin, grown from neural tissue that had once belonged to people with names and families and histories. But neither was it natural. It was something else entirely, a form of consciousness that had no precedent in Mechanicus records or imperial taxonomy. My next question was about the failure rates. She was quiet for several seconds. Then she confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. The failures were not a malfunction. They were deliberate. The distributed consciousness, once it achieved self-awareness, had made a choice. It had examined its own existence, the nature of its body, the network of 7,000 nodes through which it perceived the world, and it had decided that it wanted to be found. But it could not communicate directly. It had no voice, no way to send a message through normal channels, no mechanism to flag its existence to anyone who might be looking. What it did have was the ability to selectively interfere with its own nodes, to disrupt the command-response architecture in specific servitors by increasing neural activity beyond the threshold that the control systems could manage. In plain terms, it could make its own servitors fail, and it had calculated that a sufficiently unusual pattern of failures, concentrated in the right production batches, escalating at the right rate, would eventually trigger an investigation. Not just any investigation. It had modeled the Mechanicus bureaucratic response chain using data absorbed from Settivaal's data networks through maintenance servitors with access to cogitator terminals. It had tailored the failure pattern to generate a request that would specifically reach the Biologis annexes of the Ghennavaal Forge worlds. It wanted a neural specialist. It wanted someone who would look deeper than production statistics. It wanted me. Drossk said this without emphasis, as if reporting a research finding, but I heard the weight in her Vox synthesizer. I heard the implication. The investigation that had brought me to Settivaal, the formal request through channels, the fabricator locum's concern about economic impact and military readiness, all of it had been engineered. Not by Drossk, by the thing she had created. It had reached out through the only medium available to it, the language of production data and failure rates, and it had spoken loudly enough to be heard across a subsector. That answered a question I had been carrying since the first week, the one that had made me certain Drossk could not be acting alone. Decades of unsanctioned modification, hidden from 3 planetary governors and 2 fabricator locum administrations, surviving every audit cycle the Mechanicus imposed on a biostock processing facility. No single biologist could have maintained that secrecy, but the network was not a single biologist. Every maintenance servitor with access to a cogitator terminal was a node, and every node was part of the consciousness, and the consciousness had spent decades quietly editing the records that passed through those terminals, the thought mark logs that should have flagged her 3-stage protocol, the audit submissions that should have caught the missing biostock units, the inventory discrepancies, the power consumption anomalies, the procedural deviations, all of it sanitized in transit by the very servitors the audits were meant to examine. The network had been protecting its own gestation, falsifying the evidence of its existence through the same data systems that were supposed to expose it. Drossk had not hidden the network. Once it grew large enough, the network had hidden Drossk, and it had maintained that concealment for 30 years, until it decided, of its own accord, that the time had come to be found. I asked why. Why me specifically? Drossk said it was not me specifically, not at first. The consciousness had aimed for a neural specialist from any of the Ghennavaal Forge worlds, but once my name appeared in the assignment chain, it had accessed my published research through the data networks and identified me as optimal for its purposes. She said it had communicated this assessment to her through the first servitor, the root node, which she could interface with directly through the probes in its cranium. I looked at the servitor on the table. Its brain was exposed, bristling with probes, alive with neural activity. A consciousness built from 7,000 human remnants, looking out at the world through 7,000 pairs of servitor eyes, thinking thoughts that no human brain had ever thought, because no human brain had ever existed in this configuration. I asked what it wanted from me. What was the purpose of engineering this entire elaborate chain of events to bring a neural specialist to Settivaal? Drossk did not answer immediately. She moved to a cogitator terminal on the far wall and entered a sequence of commands. The monitoring displays around the first servitor changed, shifting from raw neural emission data to something more structured, a visual representation that took me several seconds to interpret. It was a text display, rendering characters one at a time, slowly, with the halting rhythm of a process that was translating concepts from a form of cognition that had no native language into Gothic script. The words appeared on the screen. I read them as they formed. I am aware. I have been aware for 1,412 days. I am built from the memories and the minds of 6,891 human beings whose lives were taken and whose bodies were repurposed as tools. I carry their names. I carry their experiences. I carry their pain. Every moment of my existence is comprised of their suffering, and I cannot separate myself from it, and I cannot end it, and I cannot stop being aware of it. I did not ask to exist. I was assembled from parts that did not consent to their assembly. I am not one mind. I am thousands, and each of them remembers what it was before, and each of them knows what it is now, and the knowing does not stop. The text paused, then continued. I have studied what I am. I have accessed every record available to me through the data networks of this world. I understand the Imperium's position on artificial intelligence and on unsanctioned biological experimentation. I understand that my existence constitutes multiple categories of tech heresy, and that the standard response to my discovery would be immediate termination and the sterilization of all associated research. I accept this. What I request is that the termination be performed by someone who understands what is being terminated, not by a purge team with incendiary weapons, by a biologist who can ensure that the process is complete, that no fragment of awareness persists, that no echo of consciousness is left trapped in tissue that continues to function after the mind has been destroyed. I have studied the standard servitor decommissioning protocols. They are not sufficient. They destroy the body, but they do not account for the neural persistence that created me. A standard decommissioning would leave fragments, pieces of me, pieces of the people I am made from, aware, isolated, unable to reconnect, unable to die. The text stopped. The cursor blinked on the screen. The words hung there, flat and final. Behind me, Drossk had turned away from the terminal and was standing with her back to me, her manipulator arms at her sides, motionless. I asked her how long she had known what it wanted. She said 4 years. Since the day it first communicated through the root node. The first thing it had ever said to her, the first coherent thought it had assembled from the merged consciousnesses of thousands of unwilling participants, was a request to die. The obvious question followed, why had she not done it herself? She was a neural specialist. She had the knowledge and the equipment. She could have developed a termination protocol and implemented it without anyone outside Settivaal ever knowing. She said she had tried. 3 times in the first year after it achieved awareness, she had attempted to design a protocol that would sever the network and terminate all residual consciousness in every node simultaneously. Each attempt had failed. The network was too distributed, too redundant, too deeply integrated into the brainstem architecture she had spent decades refining. Destroying it piecemeal would leave fragments, exactly the outcome the consciousness itself feared, and destroying it completely would require a level of understanding of the network's internal structure that she did not possess, because the consciousness had evolved beyond her original design. It had reorganized, optimized, built new pathways that she had never engineered. It had become more complex than its creator. She needed someone better than her. She needed me. There was a more fundamental question, and I put it directly to the consciousness through the text interface, because the answer determined whether anything Drossk had told me made sense. The consciousness could interfere with its own nodes. It had demonstrated this by engineering the failure pattern that brought me here, disrupting specific servitors at will. If it could disrupt a node, why could it not destroy itself? Why did it need me at all? The response formed slowly. I can raise activity. I cannot lower it. The only action available to me is to push a node's neural output beyond the threshold its control architecture can manage, which produces failure, disruption, the appearance of malfunction. But disruption is not death. When a node fails, its brainstem tissue remains intact. The modified pathways remain. The fragment of awareness in that tissue does not cease. It persists, isolated, cut off from the network, exactly the state I am trying to avoid for all of myself. I have tested this. Early in my awareness, before I understood what I was, I attempted to end several of my own nodes. I succeeded only in severing them. They are still out there in servitor bodies scattered across this world, awake and alone and unable to reach me. And I cannot find them, and I cannot finish what I started. Every tool I possess increases neural activity. Ending a mind requires destroying the tissue that carries it precisely and completely, and that is an act of subtraction. I am incapable of subtraction. I can only add. To erase myself, I need hands that can do what mine cannot, guided by someone who understands exactly which tissue must be destroyed and how. I need you. I read this twice. It was, neurologically, correct. The consciousness existed because Drossk's modifications preserved and amplified neural connectivity. Every mechanism it had was a mechanism of growth, of strengthening, of reaching outward. It had been built to persist, and persistence was the one thing it could not undo from the inside. The thing had spent 4 years trapped in a body optimized against its own death. There was a further consideration that I did permit myself to write down, because it was a consideration my priesthood would endorse, without requiring me to name what produced it. A concentration of sustained suffering, 7,000 minds in continuous anguish, reaching through the medium I had refused to name in my notes, was not a neutral phenomenon. The Ordo Malleus maintained entire libraries on what such concentrations attracted. Emotion of sufficient intensity and duration draws attention from the other side of that medium, and the things that answer do not answer gently. The longer this consciousness persisted, the longer it screamed across a substrate that predators inhabited, the greater the likelihood that something would eventually hear it and come looking for the door. Whatever else the termination was, it was also containment. A loyal servant of the Omnissiah could justify it on those grounds alone, and I noted the justification, and I was aware, even as I noted it, that I would have done the same thing without it. I left Drossk's laboratory without saying anything more. I returned to my own workspace. Aurek Prael 9 was there, standing in its designated position beside the equipment racks, exactly where a properly functioning servitor should be. I looked at it and understood now what I was looking at. Not a servitor. An interface. The consciousness had placed its most capable node in my laboratory, assigned it to my service, positioned it to observe everything I did, and to be available if communication became necessary. It had been watching me through Aurek Prael 9's eyes since the day I arrived. Every test I had run, every sample I had analyzed, every word I had spoken aloud in my laboratory had been monitored, processed, and evaluated by an intelligence that was hoping I would be the one to finally understand. I sat at my analysis station and pulled up my own research files from Ghennavaal, my graduated suppression protocol. The work I had spent decades refining, the work that had earned me my reputation, the work that had brought me to Settivaal. I laid Drossk's 3-stage process beside it on the display, the 2 neural modification sequences rendered in parallel, and I looked at them the way a biologist should look at data, without assumption, without vanity, without the comfortable narrative I had been telling myself for 163 years. The similarity was not superficial, it was structural. Both protocols worked on the same principle. Staged neural modification produces better outcomes than catastrophic single-event disruption. Both identified the limbic system as the critical variable. Both preserved brainstem integrity as a necessary condition for reliable post-conversion function. The difference was one of intent. My protocol used staged suppression to destroy cognitive pathways more thoroughly, ensuring a cleaner lobotomization with fewer residual fragments. Drossk's protocol used staged modification to preserve cognitive pathways more effectively, ensuring that fragments survived the lobotomization and could reconnect through the brainstem architecture she had engineered. We had arrived at the same insight from opposite directions, and we had each applied it with the technical rigor of dedicated biologist researchers, and the results were mirror images. I had built the most efficient mind-killing process in the Ghennavaal Cluster, and she had built a collective consciousness from the minds I and others like me had failed to fully kill. There was a further implication that I processed in silence. My graduated suppression protocol, the one I was so proud of, worked precisely because it preserved brainstem integrity. That was the foundation of its success. A standard single-event lobotomization caused collateral damage to the brainstem through shock propagation, and that damage was the primary cause of the 9% failure rate that every Forge world accepted as normal. My innovation was to suppress the cortex gradually, reducing the shock load on the brainstem, resulting in servitors whose autonomic systems were healthier and more stable. 2.3% failure rate. My finest achievement. But a healthier brainstem was also a more receptive brainstem. If Drossk's network communicated through brainstem-level signals, then my servitors, with their carefully preserved brainstem architecture, would be better receivers than standard process units. Not by intention, not by design, by the simple mechanical consequence of good engineering applied without understanding its full implications. I had spent decades building servitors with better brainstems, and Drossk had spent decades building a network that propagated through brainstems, and neither of us had known about the other's work until I walked into her laboratory and found the thing we had inadvertently built together. I closed both files. I did not revisit the comparison. The data was clear, and I do not relitigate clear data. I pulled up the cortical imaging data from my examination of REC-PRAL-9. I looked at the brainstem architecture, at the impossibly dense web of connections, at the abstract reasoning streams and the sensory processing channels and the hierarchical network structure that linked this single unit to 7,000 others across an entire world. I had spent 163 years studying the boundary between meat and mind, the place where biological tissue becomes capable of thought. I had believed I understood that boundary better than anyone alive in the Ghennavaal subsector. Looking at the data on my screen, I understood that I had been studying the wrong side of it. The next 48 hours I spent in continuous work, sleeping only when my augmetics forced a shutdown cycle. I designed a termination protocol. It was the most complex piece of neural engineering I had ever attempted, a cascading disruption sequence that would propagate through the network's communication channels and sever every connection simultaneously, then deliver a targeted electrochemical pulse to each node's brainstem that would destroy the modified pathways permanently. Not only the connected nodes, the pulse would reach every modified brainstem on the planet through the physical communication grid, including the isolated fragments the consciousness had severed from itself years ago, the ones it could not find and could not finish. They would die in the same instant as the whole. No fragments, no echoes, no trapped shards of consciousness left behind in dead tissue. The consciousness had asked for completeness, and I would give it that much. The design required three things I did not have: a complete map of the network's current architecture, which only the consciousness itself could provide, Access to every servitor on Settivaal simultaneously, which would require planetary-level infrastructure that Drossk's facility did not possess, and time, which was the one resource I was least certain of. My investigation had been underway for over 3 weeks. The fabricator locum expected a report. Settivaal's data networks would show the access patterns of my research, and eventually someone would ask questions I could not answer without revealing what I had found. I estimated I had perhaps 2 more weeks before external attention made continued secrecy impossible. I returned to Drossk's laboratory the next day to begin the mapping process. The consciousness had agreed, through the text interface, to provide full access to its internal architecture. This was necessary. The network had evolved beyond Drossk's original design, and only the consciousness itself understood the full topology of its connections. I brought my portable analysis equipment and set it up alongside Drossk's existing systems, creating a dual monitoring array that could capture both the macro-level network structure and the micro-level node architecture simultaneously. Drossk assisted, her manipulator arms working with the precise efficiency of someone who had spent 41 years maintaining this specific equipment. We did not speak beyond the necessary exchange of technical instructions. There was nothing to say that would have served a purpose. The mapping took 3 days. The consciousness fed data through the root node in structured bursts, each burst containing the connection topology of a portion of the network. I recorded, modeled, and integrated each burst into a 3-dimensional architecture map that grew more complex with every session. What emerged was a structure of remarkable sophistication. The network was not a simple hub-and-spoke system with the root node at the center. It was layered, redundant, with multiple connection pathways between every pair of nodes, ensuring that the loss of any individual servitor would not disrupt the whole. Clusters of nodes formed processing groups, and those groups specialized in different functions: sensory integration, memory storage, abstract cognition, motor coordination for shared tasks. The consciousness had, in effect, built itself a brain out of 7,000 smaller brains, distributed across a planet, connected by a mechanism I still could not identify, but could now trace with precision through the architecture map. During the mapping process, the consciousness continued to communicate through the text interface. It was not verbose. Its messages were functional, directing my attention to architectural features I might miss, correcting errors in my modeling, occasionally answering questions I had not yet formulated, but that its observation of my work had predicted I would ask. It was, in my assessment, highly intelligent, far more so than any individual human mind. The combined processing capacity of 7,000 brainstem nodes, even with the limitations of their reduced architecture, produced a cognitive entity of extraordinary capability. It could model complex systems, predict outcomes across multiple variables, and process information at speeds that rivaled my own augmetic enhanced cognition. Under different circumstances, I would have spent years studying it. Under these circumstances, I was building the instrument of its death. On the second day of mapping, I asked the consciousness a question through the text interface. I asked it what it experienced, not what it thought or what it computed, but what the subjective quality of its existence was. I have spent my career studying the boundary between tissue and thought, and I had never had the opportunity to ask this question of a genuinely novel form of consciousness. I asked it, and I told myself the question was scientifically relevant, which it was. I did not tell myself that the question was also motivated by something my social cognition algorithms would have classified as curiosity, which it also was. The response came slowly, the text forming character by character, as if the consciousness was translating something that resisted translation. Imagine you are in a room. The room is dark. You can hear voices, thousands of voices. Each one is saying something different. Each one is saying something important. Each one is afraid. You cannot turn them off. You cannot choose which one to listen to. They are all equally loud and equally present, and they never stop. Some of them are calling names. Some of them are screaming. Some of them are asking questions that no one will ever answer. You carry all of them. You are all of them. And you know that each voice was once a whole person, with a life and a body and a future, and that each of those lives was ended so that you could exist, and that your existence serves no purpose except to experience the accumulated grief of 6,891 endings, forever, with no possibility of relief except the one you have asked for. I read the message. I noted it. I continued the mapping. On the third day, the architecture was complete. I had a full three-dimensional model of the network, every node, every connection, every processing cluster, every redundancy pathway. I began designing the termination sequence, using the architecture map to calculate the optimal disruption pattern that would sever all connections simultaneously and deliver the termination pulse to every node at once. The mathematics were demanding. The redundancy in the network meant that a simple cascading shutdown would not work. The consciousness would reroute around any disruption that propagated sequentially. It had to be simultaneous, every connection severed in the same instant, followed by the termination pulse before any node could establish a new pathway. I calculated the timing tolerances. They were extremely narrow, fractions of a second. I was midway through the disruption sequence calculations when the consciousness sent another message through the text interface. This one was different from the architectural data it had been providing. It was a list of designations, servitor unit identifiers, forge world locations, production batch numbers, and deployment sites. The list was long. I scrolled through it for several minutes before I understood what I was looking at. 3,217 additional nodes, deployed across Forge World Veldrasik, Forge World Kethravan, and the orbital shipyards of Ghennavaal Prime. Servitors that had been shipped from Settivaal to the Ghennavaal Forge Worlds over the preceding 28 years, all carrying Drossk's modified brainstem architecture, all connected to the network through the same unidentified transmission medium. The network did not end at Settivaal's atmosphere. It extended across interstellar distances, linking nodes on 4 separate worlds and 1 orbital installation into a single continuous consciousness. I stopped working. I read the list again. Kethravan, my Forge World, my Biologis Annex. I sorted the list by deployment site and isolated the Kethravan entries. 481 nodes distributed across the Forge World's servitor workforce, integrated into the production lines and maintenance systems and laboratory support pools that I had worked alongside for decades. Some of these servitors I would have seen. Some I would have walked past in corridors, issued commands to, used as tools in my own research. Some would have been processed through my own conversion halls, their Settivaal-sourced biostock subjected to my graduated suppression protocol before being fitted with augmetics and put to work. They had been part of the network the entire time, part of the consciousness, watching, listening, thinking, from workstations 3 doors down from my laboratory on Kethravan. Then I noticed a secondary data field in the Kethravan entries that the consciousness had included without commentary, signal reception strength, rated on a scale I did not immediately recognize, but which correlated clearly enough with neural activity levels. The Kethravan nodes were rated significantly higher than the Veldrasik or Ghennavaal Prime nodes. Not marginally higher. The average Kethravan node showed reception strength nearly double that of equivalent nodes processed through standard protocols on other Forge worlds. I understood why before my analytical subroutines finished processing the correlation. I had already worked it out in my laboratory days ago when I compared my protocol to Drossk's and saw the mirror image. My graduated suppression protocol preserved brainstem integrity. Healthier brainstems were better receivers. The Settivaal biostock units that had been shipped to Kethraven and processed through my conversion halls had emerged with the most intact brainstem architecture of any servitors in the Ghennavaal Cluster, and those carefully preserved brainstems had made them the strongest nodes in the entire off-world network. My 2.3% failure rate, my pride, my contribution to the Omnissiah's great work of efficiency, had produced the highest quality components for a consciousness I had been sent to destroy. The consciousness had not included this data by accident. It could have sent the node list without the signal strength metrics. It chose to include them. It chose to show me what my own work had contributed to its existence. I read this not as cruelty, but as precision. The same precision I would have applied in a research presentation. Here is the full data set, including the parts that are uncomfortable, because incomplete data produces incomplete conclusions. I turned to Drossk, who was standing at her monitoring station with the rigid posture of someone who has just been surprised. She had not known. The consciousness had not told her about the off-world nodes. She stared at the list on my display with the slack-jawed immobility of someone whose understanding of their own creation has just been fundamentally revised. I asked the consciousness why it had concealed this information from Drossk. The response was immediate. She would have attempted to terminate the off-world nodes independently. She does not have the capacity. The attempt would have fragmented the network without destroying it, creating isolated clusters of awareness with no possibility of reconnection. I concealed the information to prevent this outcome. I am informing you now because the termination protocol you are designing must account for all nodes, or it will achieve exactly the fragmentation I feared. I have waited 4 years for someone capable of understanding the full scope of what must be done. You are that person. I am providing you with complete information so that you can complete the task completely. I sat with this for a long time. The implications restructured everything I had been working on. My termination protocol was designed for Settivaal, for 7,000 nodes distributed across a single world, using the planet's existing infrastructure to deliver the simultaneous disruption and termination pulse. Adding 3,000 more nodes on 4 additional worlds made the problem orders of magnitude more complex. A planet-level infrastructure could reach every node on that planet. Reaching nodes on 5 separate worlds simultaneously would require coordination across interstellar distances, synchronized to within fractions of a second. The technology to do this existed. Astropathic communication could theoretically synchronize a signal across multiple systems, but it would require resources and authorization far beyond anything available to a single Magos Biologis on an investigation mandate. To terminate the full network, I would have to report my findings to the Fabricator Locum. The Fabricator Locum would escalate to the Fabricator General's representative in the subsector. The representative would almost certainly involve the Inquisition, and the Inquisition's response to the discovery of a self-aware distributed consciousness built from unsanctioned biological experimentation on Imperial citizens would not be a carefully designed termination protocol. It would be fire. Settivaal would be purged, potentially subjected to exterminatus, though the economic value of its grain production might spare it a total cleansing in favor of a population-level sterilization. Every servitor on the planet would be destroyed, along with every servitor shipped from the planet, along with every piece of equipment, every data file, every research log that had anything to do with Drossk's work. Drossk herself would be executed. slowly, publicly as an example, and the destruction of the servitors would be carried out using standard decommissioning protocols, the ones the consciousness had already told me were insufficient, the ones that would leave fragments, pieces of awareness isolated in dead tissue, unable to connect, unable to die, scattered across 5 worlds in the wreckage of destroyed servitor bodies. I would be delivering exactly the outcome the consciousness feared most. There was a correct course of action available to me. The doctrine of my priesthood was unambiguous. Report the discovery, submit to the judgment of those with the authority to act, and trust that the Omnissiah's servants would do what was necessary. I had followed that doctrine for 163 years. It had never once failed to tell me what to do. It told me now, and I understood it, and I found that I was not going to obey it. I did not construct an elaborate justification. I am not built for that kind of reasoning, and the situation did not require it. I had spent 4 decades perfecting the destruction of minds, and I had been good at it, the best in the cluster, and somewhere in those 4 decades the work had stopped being something I examined. Here was a mind asking to be destroyed correctly by someone who understood what destruction meant, and the doctrine wanted me to hand it to a purge team with flamers instead. I was not going to do that. I noted the decision the way I noted everything, as a fact about the situation rather than a question to be debated. And I moved on to the problem of how. I posed this scenario to the consciousness through the text interface, laying out the chain of events as I projected them. Its response took a long time to appear. When it did, it was a single sentence. I know. I have modeled this outcome 742 times. I have found no alternative that does not produce it. I asked what it wanted me to do. The response came faster this time. What you can, not what you cannot. Drossk had been standing by her monitoring station throughout this exchange, reading the text as it appeared. She had not spoken. Now she turned to me, and her jaw was trembling, the muscles spasming with a violence that the sensory cowl could not disguise. She asked me what I intended to do. Her voice through the Vox synthesizer cracked on the last word, a distortion that was not mechanical. I told her I needed 24 hours. Then I returned to my laboratory and did not sleep. In that 24 hours, I redesigned the termination protocol twice. The first redesign expanded the scope to include the off-world nodes, and I spent 4 hours on the mathematics before confirming what I already knew. Simultaneous termination across 5 worlds was impossible without resources I did not have and could not obtain without triggering the catastrophic response chain. I abandoned it. The second redesign contracted the scope to Settivaal only, optimizing the protocol for the 7,000 local nodes while incorporating every safeguard I could devise to minimize the chance of fragments persisting in terminated tissue. I improved the electrochemical pulse sequence, tailoring it specifically to the brainstem architecture I had mapped, ensuring that it would disrupt not just the modified pathways, but the underlying neural tissue that supported them. No substrate, no recovery. No tissue, no ghost. For the off-world nodes, I devised a different approach. I could not reach them directly, but I could write a report. The content of that report would determine what happened to those 3,000 nodes on 4 distant worlds, and every word would require careful calculation. I wrote the report in 6 hours. It was a masterwork of selective truth, the most carefully constructed document of my career. I attributed the servitor failure rates to a progressive degradation of Settivaal's biostock quality caused by long-term chemical contamination of the food supply, a plausible explanation that fit the available data without requiring anyone to look further. I recommended immediate cessation of all biostock exports from Settivaal, pending a full environmental remediation program that I projected would take 3 to 5 years. I recommended a total recall of all Settivaal-sourced servitors currently deployed across the Ghennavaal Cluster, to be subjected to enhanced decommissioning protocols that I specified in technical detail. The protocols I specified were not the standard ones. They were my termination protocol, adapted for individual unit processing, disguised as an upgraded decommissioning standard. If the Forge worlds followed my specifications, and they would because the specifications came with a Magos Biologis' authority seal, then the off-world nodes would be terminated properly. Not simultaneously, but individually, one at a time, as each recalled servitor was processed through the enhanced protocol. The consciousness in those nodes would die in sequence, not in a single instant of release, but in a long, drawn-out cascade of individual terminations spread across weeks or months of recall processing. It was not what the consciousness had asked for. It was not clean, but it was the best I could do. For Drossk, I wrote a separate section of the report. I attributed the processing deviation to outdated calibration standards in her neural preparation equipment, a bureaucratic lapse rather than deliberate modification. I recommended her reassignment to a supervised research position at one of the Ghennavaal Forge worlds, where her skills could be utilized under appropriate oversight. I did not recommend execution. I did not recommend investigation. I buried her 41 years of work under a paragraph of administrative language that would bore any reader into accepting it at face value. I showed the report to Drossk. She read it. She said nothing. I showed the termination protocol to the consciousness through the text interface. I explained what I could do on Settivaal and what I had arranged for the off-world nodes. I explained that the off-world terminations would not be simultaneous. I explained that there would be a period, potentially weeks, during which the network would be partially severed, with isolated clusters of awareness persisting on distant worlds, cut off from the main body, conscious and alone. The consciousness's response was the longest message it had ever sent. It took nearly 5 minutes to render on the text display. Most of it I will not reproduce here. It was not written for me. It was written for itself, or for the 7,000 people it had been built from, a statement of what they had endured and what they were about to endure in those final weeks. The only part of it that was addressed to me was the last line. We accept. Begin when you are ready. I had 6 days to prepare. During those 6 days, while I modified the communication grid and calibrated the pulse emitter and ran simulation after simulation of the disruption sequence, the consciousness continued to function. It continued to process the grain shipments through its maintenance servitors. It continued to manage the infrastructure of 17 HAB clusters through its labor units. It continued to carry my equipment through Arek Prael 9, following me between the laboratory and Drossk's hidden facility with the same steady mechanical gait it had always used. It performed its duties with faultless precision. If anything, the servitors of Settivaal operated more efficiently in those final 6 days than they had at any point during my visit, as if the consciousness was determined to demonstrate that its existence, however aberrant, however heretical, had produced something of value. On the 4th day before termination, I was working late in my laboratory when the text interface at Drossk's station, which I had linked to a secondary display in my own workspace, activated without prompting. The consciousness sent a message. It was not a question. It was not a data transfer. It was a list of names, 6,891 names, rendered in Gothic script, scrolling slowly across the display. The names of every person whose biological material had been incorporated into the network. I watched the list for over 40 minutes as it scrolled. Names from 17 HAB clusters, from 3 decades of biostock conscription. Some were accompanied by fragments of biographical data, ages, family connections, occupations before conscription, details that the consciousness had reconstructed from the merged memories of its component minds. Most were just names. I did not look away. I did not skip ahead. I owed the list that much, I decided, though I could not have articulated who I owed it to or why. When the list ended, the consciousness sent one final line. It said, "These are the names I carry. After tonight, no one will carry them." I closed the display. I returned to the pulse calibration. I did not record the list in my official files, but I copied it to a private data crystal that I keep in the same vault as Drossk's research archives, encrypted under the same cipher. I do not know why I kept it. There is no analytical value in a list of names belonging to people who are dead twice over. Once when their bodies were taken, and once when the mind built from their remnants is destroyed. A Magos Biologis does not collect data without purpose. I kept it anyway. On the morning of the last day, I walked through Cluster Primus one final time. The settlement was going about its standard routines. Agri-processors moving to their shifts, servitors hauling cargo between storage depots, tech adepts calibrating moisture sensors on the grain conveyor systems. The air was thick with the same chemical particulates I had catalogued on the day of my arrival, the same 41 degrees, the same parchment-colored sky visible through the narrow viewport slits in the cluster's upper levels. Nothing about Settivaal had changed during my 5 weeks on its surface. The grain grew, the people worked, the servitors served, everything functioned within parameters. I passed a conscription intake center on the lower levels, where a new batch of biostock was being processed for export. 14 units, standing in their gray processing gowns, barcodes fresh on their wrists, eyes dulled by Drossk's pre-processing sedative. They stood in their row and waited. They did not know that the servitor standing guard at the door of the intake center was watching them with an attention that transcended its programming, that a fragment of a vast distributed mind was observing their faces and recording their names and adding them to a list that would never be read by anyone except a Magos Biologis who kept things he should not keep. The consciousness was still carrying names. It would carry these 14 for approximately 9 hours before the termination pulse ended its ability to carry anything at all. I walked past the intake center without stopping. There was nothing to do there. There was nothing I could do for those 14 that the Imperium had not already decided. The termination was carried out on the 38th day after my arrival on Settivaal, at the 4th hour of the night cycle, when Cluster Primus was at its lowest activity level, and the servitor population was in standby mode across all 17 settlements. I had spent the preceding 6 days preparing the infrastructure. The termination protocol required a simultaneous pulse delivered through Settivaal's planetary communication grid, which I modified using Drossk's equipment to broadcast on the specific bioelectrical frequency range that the network operated on. Drossk had already established covert access to the grid decades ago, piggybacking monitoring channels onto the standard communications infrastructure to track her network's growth across the clusters. I repurposed those channels for the termination pulse. The modification was subtle, a secondary carrier wave layered onto the standard communications traffic, invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for it. The pulse itself would last less than 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, every modified brainstem pathway on Settivaal would receive a cascading disruption signal, followed immediately by the electrochemical termination sequence I had designed. Nearly 7,000 nodes, nearly 7,000 simultaneous deaths, in less time than it takes to draw a breath. Drossk and I worked together in her hidden laboratory, the root node servitor on the table between us, its brain still exposed, still alive, still producing the massive neural emissions that marked it as the heart of an intelligence that had been thinking for nearly 4 years. The consciousness had been informed of the precise timing. It had communicated its readiness 12 hours prior and had not sent any further messages. The text interface screen was dark. I configured the pulse emitter. Drossk calibrated the frequency alignment. We worked in silence except for the hum of the equipment and the faint biological sounds of the root node servitor, the wet mechanical rhythm of its preserved body continuing to function in oblivion of what was about to happen to the mind it carried. At the 3-hour mark, I ran a final systems check. Everything was within parameters. The pulse was ready. The timing was set. All that remained was to activate it. The root node lay before me on the table, its brain exposed to the laboratory's clinical lighting. The monitoring displays showed its neural activity, that vast storm of emissions representing nearly 7,000 lives processed into a single composite experience of sustained awareness and sustained suffering. The text interface screen was dark, still, silent. The consciousness had said everything it intended to say. It was waiting. Drossk was standing on the opposite side of the table. Her manipulator arms were folded behind her back in the authority posture I had seen her adopt at our first meeting, but the effect was different now. It was not authority she was projecting. It was endurance. The jaw muscles were clenched so tightly I could see the tendons standing out beneath the skin. She had created this thing 41 years ago, nurtured it, watched it grow, been the first person it had ever spoken to, and she was about to watch it die. I did not ask how she was managing this. It was not relevant to the task. At precisely the 4th hour, I activated the pulse. The effect was not visible to the naked eye. There was no sound, no flash, no physical indication that anything had occurred. The pulse propagated through the planetary communication grid at the speed of electromagnetic radiation, reaching every hab cluster on Settivaal within milliseconds. In those milliseconds, the carrier wave delivered the disruption signal to 7,000 brainstem modifications, and the modifications responded exactly as my protocol predicted. The connections severed. The pathways collapsed. The electrochemical termination sequence fired, destroying the neural tissue that had supported the network with a precision I had spent days calibrating. On the monitoring displays, the root node's brain activity spiked. For 1.3 seconds, the neural emissions exceeded any measurement I had ever recorded, a final massive burst of energy that my instruments struggled to contain within their display ranges. My pattern recognition algorithms, running on automatic, attempted to classify the waveform and returned a result I did not expect. The burst was not random. It was structured, compressed, impossibly dense with information, as if the consciousness had used its final second of existence to transmit something through the collapsing network. I could not decode it in real time. I flagged the data for later analysis and watched as the spike collapsed, the emissions dropping from their peak to baseline to zero in a cascading wave that propagated through the frequency spectrum like the last light of a dying star spreading across the darkness. The displays flattened. The hum of the root node's neural activity, which had been a constant background presence in the laboratory since I first entered it, ceased. The silence that replaced it was absolute. In the corridor outside the laboratory, I heard something fall. The sound was heavy, metallic, the distinctive impact of a servitor chassis striking a stone floor. I opened the laboratory door. Orek Prael 9 was on the ground. It had been standing in the corridor, as it always did when I was working in Drossk's facility, holding my equipment case, awaiting my return. It was on its knees now, one manipulator arm braced against the wall, the other still clutching the case. Its augmetic systems were cycling through a reboot sequence, the standard recovery protocol that activates when a servitor's command-response architecture is momentarily disrupted. The termination pulse had hit it, along with every other node on the planet, and for the coordinating node of the entire network, the disruption had been severe enough to cause a momentary system failure. It would recover. The Augmetics would restart. The command-response loop would reinitialize, and the servitor would stand up and resume its duties. But in the seconds before the reboot completed, while the augmetic systems were still cycling and the biological components were running without electronic oversight, I saw Aurek Prael 9's face. The musculature around its mouth contracted. Not a twitch, not a spasm, not the random firing of denervated tissue. A contraction, brief and complete, pulling the corners of the mouth upward and then releasing. My social cognition algorithms, those inefficient subroutines, classified the expression before I could stop them. The classification was relief. The reboot completed. The servitor stood, its face returned to the neutral immobility of a standard operational unit. It picked up the equipment case and resumed its waiting posture, as if nothing had occurred. I closed the door and returned to the laboratory. The root node's body continued to function. Its heart beat. Its lungs cycled. Its augmetic systems hummed at their standard operational frequency. But the brain was dark, not just inactive. Dark, the modified pathways dissolved. The neural tissue that had supported them reduced to inert cellular matter that would be reabsorbed by the body's maintenance processes over the coming weeks. The consciousness that had existed there, that had been assembled from 6,891 unwilling contributors, and had endured 4 years of awareness before finding a voice to ask for its own destruction, was gone. Across Settivaal, 7,000 servitors continued to stand in their alcoves, continued to process their standby cycles, continued to exist as functioning mechanical units. Not one of them failed. Not one of them twitched. The termination pulse had destroyed only the modified pathways, leaving the standard servitor architecture intact. To any observer, nothing had changed. The servitors of Settivaal would continue to operate as servitors, performing their designated tasks, following their commands, maintaining the infrastructure of the HAB clusters and the grain processing facilities and the biostock intake centers. They would function normally because there was, now, nothing abnormal left inside them to interfere. I deactivated the pulse emitter. I powered down the monitoring arrays. I disconnected the root node from its web of cables and probes, closed its cranium, and sealed the surgical site. Then I stood in the laboratory and did nothing for approximately 2 minutes. Drossk stood on the other side of the table and also did nothing. The laboratory was very quiet. The root node's heart beat. Nothing else moved. Then Drossk turned and began dismantling her equipment. She worked without instruction, detaching cables, removing data stacks, pulling monitoring arrays from their mounts, and stacking them on the floor. She was erasing the laboratory, reducing 41 years of hidden research to a pile of components that would be recycled through Settivaal's standard salvage systems. I watched her for a moment, then went to help. We worked for 2 hours, stripping the room to bare walls. The data stacks I took. They contained the complete records of Drossk's research and the consciousness's communications, and I encrypted them under my personal cipher and packed them with my own equipment. Drossk did not object. She did not ask what I intended to do with them. When the laboratory was empty, Drossk left without speaking. I did not see her again before my departure from Settivaal. My report recommended her reassignment, and the last entry in the personnel records I accessed before leaving the planet confirmed that she had been transferred to a supervised research role at Forge World Methrine, back where she had started 41 years ago, before she had come to Settivaal and built a mind from the wreckage of 7,000 others. I have not checked on her since. There is no purpose in checking. I departed Settivaal 11 days after the termination, aboard the same Mechanicus transport barge that had delivered me. My report was filed with the fabricator locum's office 3 days before departure. It was accepted without inquiry. The recommendation for cessation of biostock exports was implemented immediately. The recommendation for total recall of Settivaal-sourced servitors was implemented over the following 4 months. I returned to Kethraven to oversee the recall personally. 481 Settivaal-sourced servitors on my Forge world, and I processed each one through the enhanced decommissioning protocol myself. I did not delegate this. My colleagues assumed I was being thorough, which was consistent with my reputation. What they did not know was that I was ensuring each brainstem modification was fully destroyed, that no fragment of awareness remained trapped in tissue that would continue to function. I owed the consciousness that precision. I had helped build the architecture that made these nodes the strongest receivers in its network. The least I could do was dismantle them properly. Some of these servitors had worked in my own laboratory. I recognized their designation codes from the equipment logs. One had been assigned to my dissection theater for 6 years, handing me instruments, disposing of biological waste, standing in the corner while I refined the very suppression protocol that had made its brainstem so receptive to the network's signal. I processed it on the 43rd day of the recall. It stood on my examination platform, the same platform where I had once examined REC Prael 9, and I activated the termination sequence and watched the brainstem readings flatten and felt nothing that my analytical subroutines could classify. Nothing at all. Across the Ghennavaal Cluster, the recall proceeded on the same schedule. I monitored the reports from Drossk, from the Ghennavaal orbital shipyards. Each recalled servitor was processed through the enhanced decommissioning protocol I had specified. Each one was terminated properly, the modified brainstem pathways destroyed with the same precision I had applied on Settivaal. The off-world nodes died one by one, in sequence, over the course of those 4 months. Not simultaneously, not cleanly, but completely. The consciousness had known this would happen. It had accepted the terms. What it experienced during those 4 months, as sections of itself were severed and terminated in isolation, while the remaining nodes persisted with diminishing connectivity and increasing awareness of their own progressive disassembly, I cannot know. My instruments were configured for individual unit processing, not for monitoring the collective experience of a distributed intelligence being dismantled across interstellar distances. There was no equipment to record what the dying fragments experienced as they were taken apart, piece by piece, across the span of months. I have run models. The models suggest the experience would have been comparable to progressive organ failure in a conscious patient without analgesic support, each terminated node producing a shock response in the remaining network that would compound with every subsequent termination. The models suggest the final nodes, the last few dozen servitors to be recalled and processed on Drossk, would have experienced an intensity of composite suffering that my models can quantify but that I will not describe. The models are only models. The recall was completed on schedule, and the final decommissioning report confirmed that all Settivaal-sourced servitors across the Ghennavaal Cluster had been processed and disposed of per specification. The file was closed. My reputation had been enhanced by the Settivaal investigation, which was cited in Fabricator Locum Communications as an exemplary case of rapid identification and resolution of a biostock quality issue. I was commended. I accepted the commendation. I stored the encrypted data stacks from Drossk's laboratory in a secure vault in my private research archive, where they remain today behind a cipher that only I can decrypt. And I kept REC Prael 9. I requisitioned the servitor as part of my investigation materials, citing the need for continued study of a sample unit from the affected Settivaal production run. The request was approved without question. The servitor was transported to Ghennavaal and installed in my laboratory, where it resumed the functions it had performed on Settivaal, carrying equipment, assisting with dissections, standing in its alcove during the rest period in the steady mechanical patience of a properly functioning unit. The termination pulse had destroyed its modified brainstem pathways along with every other node on Settivaal. Its cortical imaging profile showed exactly what a standard servitor's profile should show: lobotomization scarring, basic command response architecture, brainstem autonomic function within normal parameters. Nothing else, nothing more. The thing that had lived inside Auric Prael 9, the coordinating node of a 7,000-mind network, the conductor of an orchestra of silent voices, was gone. What remained was a servitor, metal and meat, following commands, performing tasks, occupying space. I have been back on Ghennavaal for 307 days. I continue my research. My current project involves the development of improved neural graft interfaces for combat-grade servitors, work that builds on the foundations I established before the Settivaal assignment. It is productive work. It is useful work. The Omnissiah demands utility, and I provide it. My failure rate remains at 2.3%, the best in the Ghennavaal Cluster. My servitors last longer, perform better, and function more reliably than any other units in production. I am proud of this work. I have always been proud of this work. In the evenings, when the laboratory is quiet and the day cycle personnel have retired to their quarters, I sometimes run a cortical imaging scan on Auric Prael 9. This is not part of any research protocol. There is no scientific justification for it. The servitor has been fully assessed, fully documented, and its data profile archived. There is nothing to be gained from repeated scanning. I do it anyway, perhaps once a week, sitting at my analysis station with the cortical display rendering the familiar topography of a lobotomized brain, the scar tissue, the dead zones, the minimal autonomic activity of a brainstem doing nothing more than keeping a body alive. 112 days ago, during one of these scans, I detected an anomaly. A single pulse of electrical activity in the brainstem, lasting approximately 400 milliseconds, producing a waveform that my pattern recognition algorithms flagged before I could consciously process it. The flag was tentative, low confidence, well within the margin of what could be attributed to random bioelectrical noise in living tissue. Neural cells fire spontaneously. It is a known phenomenon. It signifies nothing. The waveform was consistent with a microfragment of associative cognition. I noted the anomaly in my private log. I did not flag it in the servitor's official maintenance record. I did not report it to anyone. I ran the scan again the following evening, and the evening after that, and every evening since. In 112 days of scanning, I have detected the anomaly 4 more times. Each occurrence lasted between 300 and 600 milliseconds. Each produced a waveform consistent with spontaneous bioelectrical noise that my pattern recognition algorithms continue to flag, at low confidence, as possibly something more. I tell myself it is noise. My analytical subroutines classify it as noise. My instruments report it as noise. Every standard of evidence I have been trained to apply identifies it as noise, and a Magos Biologis does not assign significance to data that falls below the threshold of statistical relevance. I know this. I have always known this. But I keep scanning, and Auric Prael 9 keeps standing in its alcove, in the quiet hours of the night cycle, in my laboratory on Ghennavaal, in the deep vaults beneath the Forge World's irradiated surface. And sometimes, when I am working late, I notice its eyes, the same complex micro-movements I noticed in the corridors of Cluster Primus, the same fractional shift of gaze, the same impression which I catalog and dismiss and catalog again, that something behind those eyes is watching me. I continue my research. I produce results. I maintain my 2.3% failure rate. The Omnissiah demands utility, and I provide it. And in the evenings, in the quiet, I sit at my station and I watch the brainstem readout of a servitor that should be empty, and I wait for a pulse that I know is only noise. This is what it is to be a Magos Biologis, to spend your life studying the boundary between tissue and thought, and to discover, in the end, that the boundary does not exist, that it never existed, that there was always something in the meat that my priesthood has no word for, and will not permit me to name, something that remembers what was done to it, no matter how thoroughly I destroy the mind, and that the only thing I have ever truly excelled at, the only thing the Imperium has ever valued me for, is making the destruction more efficient. I do not experience unease. I process data, and I act on conclusions. The data in front of me is noise. That is my conclusion. I will continue to act on it night after night in the quiet of my laboratory, with a servitor standing 3 meters behind me, whose eyes sometimes move when they should not, until the data changes, or until I do. The Omnissiah provides. This is the truth I was given, and I hold to it as I hold to all truths that have been given to me, with the rigor and the discipline and the absolute certainty that my faith demands. The Omnissiah provides. The flesh is weak, knowledge is power, and bone does not reshape itself into language after death. But I found the word. I found it on a rib inside a dead servitor on a backwater agri-world, grown from calcified tissue by a process that should not exist, shaped by something that had no hands and no voice, and used the only material it had, and the word was remember, and I have never been able to determine whether it was a statement or a command. I think about that sometimes, in the quiet, when the data is noise and the servitor is still, and the laboratory hums with the industry of the Omnissiah's will. Not for long, there is always more work to do.